Okay, how's it going, guys? I'm going live with Daos Day, who is a conservative social media influencer. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, how you guys doing? I'm actually really glad you said my name correctly because that's the first person who I haven't had to tell. But yeah, always great to talk with people on the other side, and should be a good civil discussion.
Sure, sure. So,
Great.
we are here to talk about capitalism. So, what's your general stance on capitalism?
Okay, so I believe capitalism, free markets, I believe are the most moral, just, and fair, and also pragmatic system known to man. And the reason I would say that, and I'm kind of going, just off the top of my mind here, but the reason I would say that is because capitalism, by nature is based off of consent, right? And obviously, I understand the argument you're going to make back to me, which is that, oh, if someone is very poor and they're being forced into working, that's not consent. But in reality, under any capitalist system that is like truly capitalist, nobody is forcing you to work, and nobody's forcing you to work for the particular job and doing the particular thing that you want to do. The reason you work in the capitalist system is because you want to better your life. You want to be able to make money. No one is stopping you from moving out in the middle of the woods and living off subsistence if you want to, or even gathering a couple of friends and starting your own socialist commune. I believe in a truly free capitalist system. You should have the right to do that, but you should also have the right to, if you want to go work for an employer, if you want to work for a company for a wage that you and that employer consensually agree upon, then yes, I believe you should be allowed to do that too. So that's why I believe capitalism is the most moral system. Also, in just in terms of purely in terms of pragmatics, I believe that that incentive for profit, that incentive to further yourself, to be able to improve your own life, that's what drives a lot of the innovations and economic growth that drives our economy and makes the lives of all of us better.
Okay, sure. So, I'll address the fairness part first, and then I'll get into the pragmatism argument. So, on the note of the fairness and the voluntary nature of capitalism, so you assert that capitalism is voluntary, and therefore that's why it's the system we should strive for, and that's why it's a good moral system. So I would disagree on a few fronts. So one, I don't think that capitalism is voluntary. I don't think wage labor is voluntary, because I think in order for something to be voluntary, there has to be a reasonable alternative. For example, if I put a gun to somebody's head and I say, "Give me all your money or I'm going to shoot you," that's not really voluntary, because being shot is not a reasonable alternative to giving me the money. And I think if you apply this logic to the capitalist system, it doesn't really show that wage labor is voluntary, because I don't think that either you go into wage labor, you get exploited, or you starve is really voluntary, because I don't see starvation as an inherently reasonable alternative, therefore making it not voluntary. And I would also say that I think even if it was, this doesn't make the argument that capitalism is the most fair system, because the implication of that is that socialism isn't voluntary, or communism isn't voluntary. However, according to Karl Marx in Critique of Gotha program, he explicitly said that all work under communism or socialism would be inherently voluntary. You choose to work for the community, and you don't even have to have one set job. He said you can be like a fisher in the morning, a critic at night, without ever being a fisher or a critic. That's kind of a loose paraphrasal. So yeah, Marx did say that socialism would be an inherently voluntary. All work would be inherently voluntary. Regarding the pragmatism argument, I think that you make the argument that the profit motive drives innovation, but I would disagree that the profit motive drives innovation in a way which communism or socialism couldn't. I don't think that the profit motive is a necessity for innovation. For example, a Harvard Business Review study recently found that patents or innovations by people who give them away are increasingly competing with patent protected for-profit innovations in many parts of the economy. And the overall conclusion of the study was that the profit motive is not needed to innovate. And I think that the profit motive is one incentive which causes us to innovate. I think that's true. However, I think it's an incentive that stifles other incentives, such as by putting all the emphasis on profit, and it stifles the incentives such as care for the community, doing things for personal development, etc. So while I don't think there's a lot of evidence, even in the context of the current capitalist economy, that innovation or that the profit motive is needed to innovate, I think that it also suppresses a lot of other incentives. So in the event that it does pose a slight supplement, which is even then not too significant, I think that in the absence of this innovation, or in the absence of this incentive, because it actively suppresses other incentives, once this incentive is done away with, other incentives would fill its role. And even if none do, it still wouldn't be that significant, because as we can see in the context of the capitalist economy, the profit motive isn't that needed to innovate. And I also think that, you say in regards to the voluntary thing, sorry, I missed going over this point. You say, well, you can make a commune, you can make a socialist commune, essentially, therefore it's voluntary. The problem with that is that's not really a neutral ground. That's not really voluntary, because still, in order to make that commune, you have to acquire the money to buy the land, and you have to acquire this money through wage labor, through the capitalist mode of production, etc. So at its root, this exchange even is still not really voluntary. Also, I would say, I defended the pragmatism argument against communism and for capitalism. However, I would pose a few arguments to you about pragmatism specifically. So, for example, within capitalism, because all prices are formed around the cost of production, and capitalism has a tendency towards increasing efficiency, leading to lower and lower costs of production, the rate of profit has a tendency to go down. And this has been empirically observed time and time again. For example, a study by Maito in 2014 analyzed the data of French economist Thomas Piketty and found that his data confirms the Marxian theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. A large meta-analysis of all the existing data on this topic from Basu 2013 found out the Marxian theory is empirically valid, etc. And the reason this is a bad thing is because rates of profit can only fall so low before the capitalist system collapses. And also, drops in the rate of profit have been identified as a cause of economic collapse in an economic analysis from Roberts 2017. So I think on all of these fronts that you brought up, pragmatism, morality, etc., I don't think that capitalism is the best system.
Okay, well, we're gonna have to break this up into shorter bits, because I try to keep track of everything you said, but I don't know if I'm understanding it all, but I'll try. So the first thing you talked about, basically wage labor, and you said that it's basically, yeah, I get what you're saying. It's basically, it's not a choice because you can just starve, right? But once again, like I mentioned before, if you want to live off of subsistence, and truly provide for yourself, and not have to produce anything that you have to sell to anyone, I mean, that's fine. I mean, really, it is. I mean, if you want to, just move in the middle of the woods, build a cabin, and live on your own, you really, there's nothing like truly stopping you from doing that. The reason that a lot of people don't want to is because they know that through the wage labor system, by working for someone else, by producing a product that they can, reasonably sell to somebody else, they can live a substantially higher quality of life doing that than they would just, living off of subsistence. It is true that in a socialist form a socialist commune, yes, I suppose theoretically you would have to acquire, some form of wealth in the capitalist system in order to, buy the land to do that. But also, if that's your idea of, that's not consensual, well, under a socialist system, if you want to, create a capitalist system, as far as I'm aware, you correct me if I'm wrong here, if a group of workers under a socialist system want to go back to capitalism, are they exactly allowed to do that?
So the problem is the question of whether or not socialism is voluntary, because people couldn't create a capitalistic business. Well, there's really no way they could create a capitalist business. It's not that they would be forcibly suppressed, but communism is, as defined by Engels, as defined by Lenin, by Marx, etc., inherently international. So it's an internationally interconnected system in which the law of value has been abolished. So in order for a business to exist, it would have to operate within the law of value. And so in order to do this, the law of value would have to exist, which under communism it internationally wouldn't. So I guess they could try to bring back the law of value, but to do so, because communism is inherently an international phenomenon, to bring back the law of value would require an international capitalist revolution, which, I don't think is likely, but I don't think this says anything about the voluntary or how voluntary socialism is in itself.
Well, the thing is, I'm saying that in a capitalist system, you can, as long as you, I suppose, okay, well, I'll be fair and say, as long as you acquire enough money to start the community, right? Under a capitalist system, you could start a socialist community within the capitalist system and totally live off of yourselves. But in a communist or socialist system, what you're basically saying is that you wouldn't be able to, and that even if a small group of workers wanted to, just break off and have their own little capitalist town or community, they wouldn't be allowed to. I think that is inherently forceful. That's you're inherently imposing communism on people without their consent.
Well, so first of all, I don't think that it is forceful at all, because, as I said, communism is an international thing. It's established internationally with the consent of the people, because obviously, how are you going to have an international communist revolution if the people don't want it? So it's established by the people internationally, and then you can say that every state or country or whatever, however you want to conceptualize it, however these patches of land would be divided, conceptualized very differently under communism, but I'm just saying this for the sake of argument. All of these places would be socialist, because socialism will have been established internationally. And therefore, to make it a capitalist town, the capitalists would have to overthrow the socialists or the communists already living in this place. And because it's, communism is internationally connected, and it's part of a totality, you can't really just have just overthrow like one state or one country and have that be capitalist, because the country that you'd have to overthrow in order to make it capitalist would be part of, inextricably tied to the totality of the international communist society. And I don't think it's forceful, however, because to say force means you're forcibly suppressing somebody from doing something, which is not the case any more than capitalists are forcibly suppressing the communist revolution, because and the reason it's not forceful is because nobody is saying, if you create a business, we're going to kill you. It's just you wouldn't really be able to create a business, because businesses inherently operate inside the capitalist law of value, which would be abolished under socialism. And you say you can just live in you say you can just live in the woods, etc. My problem with that whole argument is that people know that because capitalism is the predominant reigning system, it's very hard to subsist, and it's very hard to just live by yourself without the aid of society as a whole, without interacting with the totality that makes up society. And so I would still go back to the argument of, in order for something to be voluntary, the alternative to the thing which you're saying is voluntarily chosen has to be reasonable. And I think being isolated from society, likely starving because you don't have the support from society, likely dying because you can't go to a doctor, because you don't have money, because you're choosing not to live within the capitalist superstructure, or the large-scale capitalist society, I don't really think this is a reasonable option, and therefore I think it's wrong to call it voluntary. And again, even if you want to create a socialist society, you still have to create this socialist society through the means of the capitalist mode of production. You still have to get the money to buy the land through the capitalist mode of production. Even when you establish the socialist society, it still exists within capitalism. And also, I would say that, and I've been loosely using this terminology wrongly, and I should have corrected myself and earlier, but actually this argument that you could live under a socialist society or whatever in capitalism is not true, because as Marxists define socialism, socialism is not like a system that one country can adopt. Socialism and communism are epochs, are stages of human development which characterize an international epoch. And so therefore any like one small commune in one city is not, by the Marxian definition, socialist.
Okay, so first of all, what I would, I guess, ask you then is because, so by the way, socialist communes have existed, especially in the late 1800s. They were very prevalent in the United States and Europe. But I would ask you then, what if the capitalist state were, and you didn't have to acquire any, let's just say theoretically, right? This is not practical, but let's say theoretically, this capitalist state were to pay for that land, or acquire that land for anyone who wants to live as a socialist, and that way they can go, they don't have to pay any money to go live there, they can go live there and then live in their socialist society. Would you still consider that forceful? I'll address your other points in a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So wouldn't you consider that forceful though? Because in order to provide that for them, you have to I don't know, do that through like taxes. Isn't that kind of like a welfare thing? So wouldn't you consider that to be involuntary? And I guess that I guess if you had the option, like anybody who wants to live as a socialist, we're providing you this this commune or whatever, you can go live, and these people will take care of you, and you don't have to work. I guess in that scenario, choosing to still work while having the reasonable alternative is I guess voluntary, but that's again very theoretical. That's not a practical thing. That would be for example, that would be what I call a bourgeois concession, and bourgeois concessions are almost always overturned in the interest of profit.
Well, I mean, there are instances in the 1800s, especially, where this happened, where rich philanthropists would actually buy plots of land, and they would start their own little communes. But I guess to talk more about your other points, really skeptical of the fact that the idea that every person on earth would simply consent to the idea of communism. And I feel like I shouldn't have to explain that. It's just I'm skeptical that every single person would consensually, voluntarily, without having to force or coerce anyone, would willingly just walk into the system of communism, that every person on earth would embrace it.
Well, so regarding your first point about how people had communes before, I know that that's the case, and I know that people have had communes before, but still, it is a fact that in order to establish these communes, they had to do so within the context of broader capitalist society. And even when they established these communes, you cannot call this a socialist or communist society, because Marx, Lenin, Engels, and pretty much every prominent Marxist writer defines socialism and communism as an international epoch and not something that can be established like locally. And second of all, I would say that your second point about how people wouldn't consent to establishing communism, well, of course, that's true that not everybody would consent to establishing communism, not everybody in the world, but it's also true that not everybody in the world consented to establishing capitalism out of feudal society, and not everybody in the world consented to establishing feudal society out of slave society. And this is what we see, is that throughout human history, we have developed into these different epochs. We developed from slave society to feudal society, from feudal society to capitalist society, and all of these transitions did go through violent transitions and saw violent revolutions. Like look at the French Revolution, for example. Yeah, not everybody consented. There was violence. There was force involved. We Marxists understand, as Engels wrote in his book On Authority, that any revolution is inherently authoritarian in that it utilizes the use of force. It utilizes violence. However, to say that this invalidates the system is kind of self-defeating, because capitalism came about through the same means in large part, and therefore, if this means of achieving revolution invalidates the system, then I don't see how you can argue for capitalism in the same breath. I mean, this is just like the inevitable like role, the inevitable way that history plays out. It's not really like, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I've not read the entire Communist Manifesto. I have read that excerpt you're referring to, where Marx basically explains, how the systems of history basically progress along. But I would also argue that the capitalist system, like some form of capitalism, some form of markets, has been around basically since the beginning of civilization. Ever since the first small villages started to pop up, you saw some form. It was primitive, but there was some form of a market economy. It's important to note that while yes, feudalism was very prominent in Western Europe and Japan, the rest of the world, China, Africa, the Middle East, even places in North America, also have very market economies. In Mesoamerica, for example, South America, these are societies that developed on their own before colonization, obviously, developed on their own, basically completely independent of outside forces. And you notice they still developed, as civilization grew, they still developed some form of market economy. So I would argue that some underlying form of market, some underlying form of trade and capitalism is basically, inherent to any civilization.
Well, how do you mean? Because basically, I'm a Marxist, so I believe that capitalism is defined by the existence of a few things. So, for one, generalized commodity production. Two, the existence of the law of value, which is very specific to the capitalist epoch. Even if we look at feudalism, which capitalism emerged out of, yes, they had like private ownership over the means of production, but they didn't have generalized commodity production. They didn't have production for the sake of exchange on a market. And so, therefore, I would say that markets, as defined by the law of value and generalized commodity production, as us Marxists define it, are actually specific to the capitalist law of or to the capitalist epoch. And also, you can say that some form of this has been around for forever, but I don't really think that you can from that make a normative claim or an actual argument. People around the time of slavery could be saying we've had slavery since the beginning of time, but that's not an argument for slavery, because some traditions, such as slavery, such as even if we were to grant your premise that markets have been around since the beginning of history, developed and were very prominent throughout history because of their usefulness given certain material conditions. But one of the fundamental realizations of dialectical materialism is that material conditions are constantly changing, and therefore the traditions which we should create to adapt to these material conditions should also be constantly changing. And so appealing to something by saying it's been around for a really long time, therefore it's good, isn't really an argument. For example, moths adapted to navigate with the sun when this was useful given the material conditions. However, material conditions changed. Artificial light became more prominent. We started, having fires and candles, and now hundreds of thousands of moths, like every day, fly directly into fires and kill themselves because there is a tradition adapted which was useful given the material circumstances which are no longer applicable, and therefore this tradition is no longer useful. So I reject appeals to tradition for tradition's sake.
Well, I'm not making an appeal to. By the way, feudalism. In many instances in feudalism, the reason the heads of the manors were often so keen on this production was also, yes, the many manors were self-sufficient, but also oftentimes these manors did trade with another, and the crops and things they produced were often sold, through trade on the market. But yes, it's obviously just like slavery. There is the question of whether or not this is still, the best system, whether we should keep this around, and whether it's moral. But again, I believe capitalism, I believe markets, check out all three of those boxes.
Sure. Well, do you want to go over the because we've went over the moral thing a little bit, but would you like to go over the pragmatic argument?
Right. So this will basically be built off of the premise, which I believe is true. It's just an analysis for me, which is that humans are naturally selfish, right? Humans naturally, and this is, who knows where this comes from, but humans naturally are built to look out for themselves. When you're born and you grow up in the world, the first thing you want is to make your own life better. And that's why I believe the profit incentive is the most, pragmatic means for actually, getting up, is, let's saying, I want to make my life better, so I'm going to go work hard for it. I believe that in a system where everyone is collectively equal, there's no reason. I mean, yeah, sure, I'll care enough about the other person to work to get by, but I don't see the reason why someone would want to work hard to go that extra mile. That the extra mile that really does drive great capitalist societies. Why someone would want to push that extra step, work extra hard just for everyone else to take the benefits of their labor, and in the end they're only taking a very small portion of it. That makes
Sure.
sense.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that this argument fails to grasp how our objective analysis are always mediated by a social background which distorts the ways in which we understand society itself. So like I would say that the essence of human nature is a historically dynamic social reality and is not reducible to some objective, externally existing facts about reality. Such a way of thinking ignores the way in which our unsurpassable social and political horizon determines the quote-unquote objective conceptions about the world and about our nature, which we take for granted. So like, and I think that this is historically invalid as well. For example, like let's look at comparisons between competitive and more socialized cooperative institutions within the capitalist mode of production. So we've seen across the board that worker co-ops, which are based around cooperation, more selflessness and altruism, are more successful in general than more competitive, hierarchically structured corporations. And furthermore, as Peter Kropotkin argued in his book, in the intro to his book, The Conquest of Bread, a historical analysis of this claim very clearly invalidates it. So like, for example, hundreds of millions of men throughout history have succeeded in maintaining within their cities, villages, and so on, a key component of communism, that being public/communal ownership of the land. Furthermore, we see that throughout history, where communal ownership of the land was destroyed in Western Europe, for example, it was destroyed by virtue of external pressure rather than collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, as I believe capitalism is doing. Furthermore, medieval societies for centuries maintained a certain degree of socialized organization and trade and production through periods of rapid progress and sustainability. So I think that historically we can see that this premise of like, oh, human nature, we're too greedy, too self-centered, etc., is just historically invalid. It's conceptually invalid given the ever-changing nature and socially contingent nature of what you would call human nature, etc. And to finally kind of tie up my argument, I would say that even if we granted your premise that humans are objectively self-centered, objectively competitive, I don't think this would successfully make the argument that you're trying to make it make. So let's break this down into a premise conclusion format. So your first premise is that humans are objectively greedy, humans are objectively self-centered. Your second premise is then that greedy and self-centered people cannot work together, cannot cooperate, and therefore communism can't work because it's based on too much cooperation. However, isn't this invalidated by the fact that the level of cooperation required by communism has worked several times, as you admitted earlier on in this debate when you talked about communes in the US and so on throughout the 1800s, etc. But even capitalism itself requires a large degree of cooperation, a large degree of people being altruistic and working together. So if both of your premises were true, one, humans are objectively greedy, two, greedy people can't work together, then capitalism by no means should be able to work. So by the very fact that you support capitalism, one of those two premises which you're making to use your argument has to be false, right?
Well, sorry, I couldn't hear your last part. Could you go over the last two things again? You said those like two things. I couldn't really hear them.
So my final argument was that essentially, if you're going to take the premise that we are objectively self-centered and greedy, and you're also going to take the premise that self-centered and greedy things cannot work together, then one of these premises has to be incorrect, given the fact that you support capitalism, because if it were true that we are objectively greedy and greedy people can't work together, we would not see the level of cooperation which is necessitated by the capitalist system, which we see all the time. We see capitalist corporations engaging in mutual aid, for example, one of the key methods of exchange, which theorists like Peter Kropotkin have advocated for under communism. And so I would say that if both of your premises were valid, both the premise that we are greedy and greedy people can't work together, then we would not be living under capitalism right now, because capitalism itself requires a large level of cooperation. And even if you were able to prove, well, capitalism requires a lot less cooperation, and you could make that argument, then this argument you're making is still invalidated by the fact that, as you admitted earlier, there have been several communes, successful communes in Western Europe in the medieval times, even in the US throughout the 1800s, which have succeeded. And they didn't, and when they were crushed, they didn't collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. They were destroyed by external force. For example, the Paris Commune being destroyed externally by other militaries, etc.
Well, see, I never said that people are greedy and can't work together. What I did say was that in order to work together, people need a strong incentive, right? The reason that we work together in capitalism instead of all working on our own is because we know that, if let's just take a basic example. I know that if I go work for some Fortune 500 company, I'm not working for the good of anyone else there. But by doing so, not only I am getting paid, obviously, but by doing so, yes, I'm benefiting the company itself. I'm benefiting, my fellow workers. But ultimately, the core reason I'm there is not because I want to see that community succeed. I bet you most workers could really give a crap what happens to their company. But the only reason they care is because, number one, if that company goes under, they lose their livelihood, and number two, they're making a great deal of success off of that company. And I do believe that humans are objectively, selfish, at least to some degree, because is this not the premise of nature? Is it not like any animal, born into nature? Is their ultimate goal, usually not just to survive on their own? And obviously, they have families to look after. They obviously look out for their pack. And by the way, that's an example, similar example to the communes, which is small scale communities working together. And I do believe that is possible, but I don't believe that it is possible to be able to unite the world and to convince people that live, thousands of miles away and never seen each other in their life, that they have an obligation to work hard and to, give a portion of their, pretty much distribute all of their earnings to those people. I mean, in these, part of what makes, small scale socialist communes good, especially like that small town in Illinois, I forgot the name of, but part of the reason I was so successful is because the people cared about each other. And why do the people care so much about each other? Well, part of that reason was because, they all knew each other. They all developed a bond with each other. And this is the same bond that, forms families. But when you talk about creating, sort of this system on a global scale, I object to the fact that someone living in the United States, in the center of the United States, or what used to be the United States, would care at all and would be willing to sacrifice anything they have to, someone living in, say, Russia or China.
Sure. So the first thing you say is that, we need an incentive to work. We need an incentive to innovate. We need this thing saying, you have to work in order to get food, in order to have your means of subsistence provided for you, etc. So I would say that that's wrong on a few notes. So first of all, if you look at universal basic income, when and where people have been provided with universal basic income, they haven't worked any less. And this is just a statistical, empirically observed fact. And we can also see that to the extent which people have worked, like 1% less, they use that extra time to go to college, to do other things, to make more meaning for themselves. And they're still productive. And also we see that when workers are mass displaced, for example, in the Industrial Revolution, when workers were massively displaced, rates of suicide among these people, rates of depression among these people who were displaced, massively skyrocketed. And I would argue that the reason that people, even when they have their means of subsistence provided for them through universal basic income, and the same reason that when they can't work, they're depressed, is because humans have evolved to work for thousands and thousands of years. And therefore, work is something which is inherent to our nature. Work is something that we've seen we choose to do, even though we don't have to. And when we can't do it, we get extremely depressed because it is this inherent part of our nature. And, you say, well, a lot of people hate work. A lot of people wouldn't work. If they had all their means of subsistence provided for them. I would disagree. I'd say that the reason you quote unquote hate work is because of the alienated nature of work. Because the worker is alienated from what they produce. Of course, they're going to hate their work. Of course, they're not going to care about their work. But under communism, when the greed, which is incentivized by capitalism, erodes and the alienation erodes, then the people will be made to feel more responsible for their communities because they're no longer alienated from their work. They're no longer alienated from their communities, etc. So I think we've seen empirically, historically, people don't need, and again, this is further validated by that Harvard Business Review study, which finds that for-profit innovations are largely being done away with because of innovations from people who are unpatent protected and who are giving them away for free. I think all of this leads to the fact that work is an inherent part of our nature, and we will work without the profit motive. We don't need a profit motive to work. The reason a lot of people hate work is because of the alienated nature of work, which is specific to capitalism, which would erode under communism, etc. And you say, you made that point about how people don't care about their communities. Again, I would say that that's because of the alienated nature of the capitalist mode of production, of the worker under capitalist mode of production. And this, my thesis, which directly contradicts your claim, that if people have more of a stake in what they produce, if people aren't alienated as much, then they will care about their work more. And this can be seen empirically because studies have shown that worker co-ops, where workers directly own what they're producing, are 4 to 5%, and in some cases up to 19% more productive than traditional businesses. So this just backs up my premise that people will work harder if they're not alienated from what they're producing. So yeah, I think that overall, if we look at empirical evidence, historical evidence, etc., the overwhelming conclusion of an objective analysis is that yes, we don't need a profit motive to innovate. We don't need a profit motive to work. And I think to say otherwise is just inconsistent with what's objectively observable. And again, you say it's nature for us to work for ourselves, and I would disagree. This talking point was the subject of an entire book by Peter Kropotkin called Mutual Aid, A Product of Evolution, where he went over the evolution of several animals, including ants, butterflies, dragonflies, and even the development of societies among humans. And the core finding of this, because he was an evolutionary biologist, the core finding of this evolutionary biological analysis is that many societies of animals actually have overcome this thing of you all have to fend for yourselves, you have to work for yourselves, and have actually adopted a more like collectivist approach of like, oh, we're all going to help each other out, we're going to engage in mutual aid in this natural selective nature of like, if you're on your own, etc. Has been done away with in many animal communities, and including many societies of humans. And the second most prominent finding of this biological evolutionary analysis is that in the cases when animals and humans have done away with this, you fend for yourself mentality and adopted this system of mutual aid, which is what essentially would be the premise of communism, is mutual aid. When this has been adopted, and when this, you fend for yourself mentality, which you appeal to, has been done away with, these societies actually prosper much more. In the case of human societies, these societies develop much more. And so I would argue, because I've been kind of on the defensive for a minute, defending arguments against communism. I would pose a few pragmatic arguments against capitalism. So, for example, I already went over the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, which has been empirically observed, and which the logical conclusion of is the collapse of the capitalist system. Also, because capitalism has an inherent tendency towards the infinite expansion of capital, and also because the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, capitalists have to continually expand markets and expand their profits. And in order to do this, we see nations dominating other nations in order to expand markets, take control of goods such as oil in order to have a stronger foothold in the international market, etc. And the mechanism through which they do this is imperialism. The theory of imperialism as a mechanism of expanding markets and therefore a direct product of capitalism was confirmed by Lenin's historical analysis, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And this is increasingly a problem, as this causes imperialistic conflict leading to millions of deaths, and now, due to the spread of nuclear weapons, possibly the extermination of our species. This same tendency towards the infinite expansion of capital also leads to the exploitation of natural resources in a way which isn't sustainable for our environment. This is also increasingly a problem, as according to an international panel on climate change, we have an estimated 12 years until we feel irreversible effects of climate change. And so those are just a few of the pragmatic arguments I would pose against capitalism.
So, I mean, we can talk climate change another time, but so I guess I'll go through like that. Try to go through everything you said. So you talked about how under UBI, productivity did not really go down that much, and that's true. But also, typically speaking, when people are taxed substantially more, productivity does go down. And so what I was basically saying is not that if you are given more, you will be less productive, because I don't believe that's true. I believe that if more is taken from whatever you gain, whatever you produce, if more is taken from that, then yes, I believe your productivity will go down, because if you're working a lot and you see, this huge chunk of your pie just being taken from you, I believe it is human nature for most, and I don't want to use the word human nature, but I believe most people would naturally see that and say, hey, why should I keep working as hard as I am if all this is going to be stripped away from me? Sure, you're right. Most people will still work, yeah, but why should I work hard? Why should I go that extra mile? Why should I keep on, working as hard as I'm working if everything is guaranteed to me and I only have to work, a little bit to get what I want? And that's what I'll do. I'll work a little bit. I'll, just slow down with everything. I'll just work as much as I want to, not as much as I need to. And I believe if everyone's doing that on the full scale of society, we can theorize what happens. You talked about, people being displaced, having their lives changed because of the Industrial Revolution. Well, I would also argue that the same thing would happen under communism, under a proletariat revolution, because obviously many people would be displaced, many people will have their lives radically changed, torn apart, changed, etc. So I believe that a lot of people would likewise feel depression, feel unhappy. Let's see, your next point was, you said a lot of people, let's see, well, I'm trying to go through what you were saying. People truly. Yeah, so I believe you talked earlier, and you kind of reiterated on this about how, people will be more working to do what they want, not what they are kind of have to in a capitalist system. Sorry. I would argue that if everyone were to do what they wanted to do, what they enjoyed, I couldn't see society lasting. And the reason I say that is because in a lot of instances, what we find fun, and you can pin this on a capitalist system, sure, but what we find fun is usually not what is most productive to society, right? Like the work that I would consider, like that I would say, oh, if I were to do this for a living, I would I'd like to be like, I don't know, a YouTuber, a celebrity, right? But if everyone is trying to chase those kinds of aspirations, the very fundamental jobs of our society, I would argue, would, a lot less people would be filling those jobs. And, I believe the essential functions of society may suffer in exchange for people, chasing what they want. I also believe that capitalism, like you said, that communism is kind of the system of mutual aid. Well, in a different sense, capitalism is also a system of mutual benefit, right? It's a system in which I give something to you that you want, and you give something to me that I want, right? That's kind of the premise of the market system. It is a system in which we are mutually benefiting each other, right? Because I have something that you want, you have something that I want, right? By trading those things, we are mutually benefiting. So in that sense, considering that that's kind of what is happening on like the large scale society, I would consider that to be also a system of mutual aid. Maybe it's a more individualist system of mutual aid on a more individual level than simply the collective helping, one another. But I would still consider that to be a system of mutual benefit. You said imperialism. You talk about imperialism only being done to increase, markets. Well, I would also argue that imperialism oftentimes is simply done to increase, the wealth of an individual. I know if a country has a lot of, it's not always necessarily for market purposes. It's simply, oh, I know a country has a lot of stuff I want, and so a leader, knowing that stuff will have value, will simply go in there and take that. And I would, I would also argue that the same kind of drive to, hey, you're not giving me what I want, so I'm going to take it from you. I would argue that that same drive could exist in a communist society as well. And I think that was all of your points. So yeah, I would argue that that same drive that to take things from others that you kind of have envy for is equally as likely in a communistic system. In fact, I would argue that the system of communism itself is based off of sort of that envy for things that you don't have.
Okay, so all right. Okay, so I'm trying to go over the points. So you said that if more is taken from you, productivity goes down. So and you brought up taxes, for example. So a few notes on that. So under socialism, I don't think this can be applied to an argument against socialism, because as I've stated earlier, or maybe I haven't, I don't really remember. Under socialism, there are no taxes. Nothing is taken from you by a centralized state. And in fact, according to Lenin, establishing socialism necessarily entails the abolition of government, of the state, of even as Lenin put it, all political power. So I don't think that this can be extrapolated to an argument against communism. Under communism, nothing is taken from you, nothing is redistributed. All work is just directly social, and this is a very different mechanism. And also, even if you want to talk about taxes, even the claim that higher taxes make people work less is only to a very, very small extent true. A study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research from Gruber and Saez in 2000 found that the extent to which productivity is impacted by higher taxes is incredibly minuscule and hardly noticeable. And so even that is not necessarily true. And also, you say that people would be displaced under communism because their lives would be messed up. I don't necessarily think that's true. I mean, I think that under the phase of revolution, yes, many people's lives would be messed up. But but first of all, saying that this is the fact doesn't really negate the original point I made about displacements in our historical objective analysis of displacement's effect on the mentality of people who are displaced. I don't really think that negates that point. And second of all, I think that if the fact that in order to do a revolution, your lives will be messed up, if that was a valid argument against the system you're striving to achieve through revolution, I don't see how you could be sitting here advocating for capitalism right now, because there were many capitalist revolutions, for example the French Revolution, in which many people's lives were messed up, but the end result is, as you would argue and as I would argue as well, a much better standard of living for people. Capital.
Well, can I interject for a second? The same is true of the Industrial Revolution.
What do you mean?
Well, as a result of industrial,
no. Yeah, no, sure, but my argument isn't that capitalism is bad because this displacement happened. My argument is that you can't necessarily say that people need a profit motive to work, because as we've seen, humans generally long to work even in the absence of profit motive. And I just used the fact that people's depression skyrocketed because of work displacement to prove the point that humans do innately. It is in our nature to work, and people do long to work even in the absence of a profit motive. And I would also say, so yeah, I don't think that saying, and again, you say that people's lives were displaced in the Industrial Revolution, but it still led to a better quality of life. I would actually extrapolate that to an argument for communism, because you use the fact that because people would be displaced and people's lives would be messed up during the revolution, therefore we shouldn't try to achieve communism. But as you yourself just validated by appealing to the Industrial Revolution, many cases in which temporarily people's standards of lives went down in the long run led to a higher standard of life for everybody. And so I think that's a valid point to make, because I think when you're saying, well, yes, revolution would lead to all this turmoil, it would lead to all this suffering, you have to consider that suffering in comparison to the suffering which not doing a revolution would lead to, which is, I would argue, and I have been arguing, is a lot more suffering due to capitalism's exacerbation of the process of or of the problem of climate change, of imperialism, etc. You say that nobody will work hard jobs if they are living under communism, because everyone will just want to work the fun jobs if they can do what they want. So first of all, I'd like to point out that I think that's a little bit of a contradiction, because you were arguing earlier that capitalism is voluntary. You work, because you want to, and I don't think that's necessarily a valid argument if you're going to then say a system in which you can do whatever you want is inefficient, because you saying that just disproves and shows that you really do know that capitalism is inherently not a voluntary system. But aside from that, I think that it's not really a valid argument in general. So like an example I would like to use is, do you clean your house? You're not being paid to do it. You could easily just not clean up your house, but you still clean it. And this is because you feel responsible for it. Your house is yours. You take pride in cleaning it because you feel responsible for your house. Under communism, if the people are no longer alienated from their community, if this alienation erodes, if the selfishness which is incentivized by capitalism erodes, people will feel more responsible for their communities. This is the whole idea of communism. People will feel responsible for their communities, and so they will still clean up their community and do these hard jobs when they are necessary, for the same reason you clean your house. The only reason that you don't think this cleaning your house and cleaning up your community is a valid comparison is because you don't feel responsible for your community, but you feel responsible for your house. To which I would say you only don't feel responsible for your community because of the alienation of the worker from their community, which is inherent to capitalism and wouldn't exist under communism, and therefore that kind of argument wouldn't be valid. You say capitalism is based on a situation of like mutual aid, like I have something you want, you have something that I want, and we trade it. However, I think to say that massively underestimates the leverage which the capitalist has over the worker. It's not like two people have something and they're like, yeah, let's exchange because we both want this voluntarily. It's like the worker is literally going to die if he doesn't sell his wage labor to the capitalist, and the capitalist has the means of subsistence and says, if you want to live, you're going to have to work for me. And so I don't really think that you could characterize this as like some voluntary exchange of mutual aid. Again, it goes back to my premise that in order for something to be voluntary, there has to be a reasonable alternative. And I don't think that starving, the alternative to wage labor, is a reasonable alternative, and therefore it's wrong to characterize it as voluntary, and therefore it's wrong to characterize it as like this mutual aid exchange. And you say that imperialism is in often cases done to increase one person's like individual wealth, and I think that's absolutely true. However, that is an argument that capitalism causes imperialism, and I think you just proved my point, because the concept of wealth, the concept of currency in general, is inherent to capitalism. Part of one of the core purposes of communism is the abolition of currency, is the abolition of this concept of wealth. So in saying that imperialism is in many cases done to increase one person's wealth, what you are admitting is that imperialism is caused by social constructs which are inherent to capitalism, which wouldn't exist under communism. And when you couple this assertion that you yourself made, this realization that you yourself made, you realize that when you couple this with the realization that imperialism is an increasingly dangerous phenomenon, we now have nuclear weapons. We're on the verge of nuclear war with many countries. And if a new nuclear war to break out, it would exterminate likely our entire species. And so when you couple this, you yourself have just made the argument that that capitalism and the constructs which emerge out of capitalism are one of the biggest threats to human extinction today, which I think makes my argument better than I myself was able to make it. And you also say that communism is based off envy. That's very not true. Communism is a system in which all money is abolished, in which wealth is abolished. In order to say that it's based off envy, the communists would be like, have to say like, you have money, I want money. This is just inherently untrue. We don't say you have money, I want money, so we're going to take your money. We say you have money, but the social construct of money is very harmful in objectively observable ways, and therefore we're going to abolish the construct of money in a way which is objectively, in a way which nobody can have it. So I don't think you can characterize it as envy if we're not striving to take what somebody else has. We're striving to abolish it because we believe that through an objective analysis, we can see that it is objectively harmful. So to characterize it as a product of envy, I think is just fundamentally wrong. Another thing that I would add on, because again we've been on the issue of the pragmatic aspect of capitalism. I would like to add a few things. So I've been over how capitalism, under capitalism, there's an inherent tendency for the rate of profit to fall. This has been empirically observed, and the rate of profit can only fall so far before the whole system collapses. I've explained how the inherent tendency towards the infinite expansion of capital leads to climate change in the exploitation of natural resources, as well as imperialism. And also, I would like to add that capitalism is inherently based on the exploitation of the worker. So prices are built around the cost of production. Therefore, the cost of production represents the equilibrium which supply and demand cause prices to oscillate around. This is essential. This is the essential argument of like the labor theory of value, for example. Therefore, the logical conclusion of this is that at equilibrium, the only way to make profit can be through the extraction of the surplus value of the worker, which is inherently exploitative. And not only is this a problem for the workers, but and not only is this wrong to the workers, not only does this harm the workers, but it also can be extrapolated not only from a philosophical argument to a pragmatic one, because this is part of the reason why economic collapse is inherent to capitalism. So like the realization of the extraction of surplus value, which has been empirically validated time and time again, tells us that workers produce more than they're given the means to consume. And this leads to overproduction. And because there are more goods than the people can consume, this overproduction leads to economic collapse because it hurts the profits of the corporations. And in order to get people to consume more, they stock the people up with credit, which leads to bigger collapse, etc. And so I think that in the extraction of surplus value, we found a very pragmatic and a very philosophical argument about how this surplus value, the extraction of surplus value, which is inherent to capitalism, is harmful to not only the workers, but the economy at large. So that's just one more pragmatic argument I would throw out there.
Okay, well, can you do me a favor if I like miss any of your points? Can you like remind me about them? Because I'm probably
going to remember. Sure.
Yeah. So I guess I was gonna say something. Let's see. Well, the first thing I had written down was that I would say the driving force for imperialism, which is basically that kind of drive to take what is the I guess the property of others, for your own personal gain. I would argue that that's been around long before capitalism was even envisioned as a system. Even when we were hunter-gatherer tribes would, if tribes saw that another tribe had a lot of food, it would have been natural for that tribe to at least feel the urge. Maybe they didn't have the resources to do it, but at least feel that urge to kind of maybe try to either steal the food from that tribe or even take that food by force. And I would argue I understand that the whole basically concept of communism is based off of sort of changing the psychology of every person involved in the system, basically weaning them off of this whole idea of wage labor, this whole idea of materialism. But I would argue that if communism were to be established, even with some significant education, even if you tried really, really hard to change the psychology of others, I think there would still be a lot of people who would still look at something that they do not have, but that another person has, and say, I really want that thing. And now let me look over my other points. Let's see. So you talked about how under communism, essentially, you can do I mean, under capitalism, you really can't do what you want because obviously, you know, you talked about the reasonable alternative. So again, my argument would be you can do whatever you want, but you're not owed anything from others, you know, for what you do, right? Like I can say, I can sit in my backyard and, you know, build a bunch of dirt mounds, right? But under the system of capitalism, basically you would have to do something that is productive to others in order for others to give you something that you want. And I would argue that that is a fair and just system, right? Because in order for other people to give me something, right, something that I want, I should have to do some. Did you cut out? Sorry, if you like your mic totally shut out. Excuse me. Hello. Oh, mine is off.
Yeah, sorry. Hold on. I just had to go shut my door.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Anyways, continue.
Let's see. You heard that though, right?
Yes.
Okay. So where was I? Yeah. So I believe that that is a moral system in the sense that in order for someone else to give you something that you know you that say you that you want, you should have to do something for that person that they want. And I would even argue that in a sort of anarchist system where people, you know, no wealth, nothing is taken by force, I would still argue that that would be the most moral system. Even if we get rid of the idea of currency itself, right? I would still argue that fundamentally, you know, in order for other things to, you know, in order for the other people, the community to give you things, you would have to do stuff that would give them things, right? And even in socialist communes, this is true, right? People still have to contribute in some way, shape, or form, right? In order for the other people to contribute to their lives, they have to contribute to, you know, other people's lives. Let me see my other stuff. I said, let's see. Yeah, so you said that basically you're arguing basically, and this is what I kind of find in a way, I guess, sort of oxymoronic about communism, which is that in a sense, private ownership does exist because there's nothing, you know, forcing anyone. Like you were basically saying that if I want to, you know, do whatever job I want, right, I would be allowed to do that, and that no one is taking, you know, the things that the benefits that I earn from doing that work, no one is taking it by force, right? So aren't you conceding then that it is actually the right and the kind of the job of the person who actually produces the work themselves to kind of distribute it and use it however they want, right? You're saying that there's no obligation for me in a socialist system to work to say, so just say I farm corn, right? If under a communist system, if there's nothing, you know, forcing me to give up that corn, I could theoretically, if I wanted to, keep all that corn for myself. Is that not the concept of private ownership? And also, is that not the concept of the sort of market idea of consent, which is that I don't actually have to give up anything. The only reason I would give it up is because other people have something that I want, and, you know, in order for me to get that thing, I would have to, you know, give them something they want, which in this case would be my corn. Let me see if I had any other points. Yeah, I would argue that a lot of the workers who did join communist movements through history were driven by some form of envy. I don't. I believe that, you know, the reason a lot of workers, you know, joined up was because they saw how rich, you know, the fat cats were, and they saw how poor they were, and, you know, wanted to establish an equilibrium. But it is essentially a lot of the reason why they actually joined is because they saw this disparity. You know, they saw a lot of people on the top are rich, and they wanted a portion of those rich people's wealth.
Sure. So is that everything?
Let me see if I could look and see if I had anything else. So I said that.
Okay.
Oh, so you also talked about how systemic collapse is, you know, possible in capitalism. To an extent, I would argue that that is true. Although I would argue also that sort of that driving force for profit is what will, even if the, you know, economy obviously goes through up and downs as it does, um, that sort of that driving force to constantly be innovating, to constantly be on top of everything. You know, I believe that would be the force, not necessarily exploiting the workers, but that drive to kind of improve the quality of the product that you're producing to consumers. That sort of constant drive would always find, you know, people. I believe people would always find a way to make, you know, some form of profits in one way or another. Like I don't know, I don't know if that even made any sense, but I'm basically arguing that people will constantly be finding a way to improve upon what they're creating, right? Because basically the premise of what you're saying is that there's a finite level in which I have achieved the best quality of product I can possibly produce for consumers, and I don't believe that really is ever true. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
And yeah, that was
Okay. Hold on. So the first argument you made was that imperialism has been around before capitalism. You appealed to like tribes ransacking other tribes for more stuff. So I would say, yeah. Well, history has been kind of like has kind of gone back and forth in some ways. So, like for example, yes, there have been tribes way back towards like the beginning of history. Or even maybe before history, if we're defining history as written records and so on. Yes, there have been tribes that would ransack other tribes for profit. There have also been many communes, such as like in the 1800s in the U.S., as you yourself referenced, etc. And also in medieval times and in Europe in the 1800s and even in the Netherlands in the early 1900s, which operated on the basis of the system of mutual aid, where many tribes, quote unquote tribes, aren't really tribes, many civilizations came together and exchanged with each other on the basis of mutual aid in a non-market exchange format, and did not engage in imperialism, etc. So I don't think that you're making the case that I don't think you've made the case that imperialism is really inherent to our nature. And because it's not inherent to our nature, because we've seen many communities adopt a system of mutual aid, many civilizations among animals adopt a system of mutual aid, because it's not inherent to our nature, but it exists under the current system. It's therefore a product of the current system and doesn't have to exist. And since I'm advocating for a system based around, say, like mutual aid, in which this imperialism wouldn't exist, and you're advocating for a system under capitalism, which it evidently does exist, even though it's not inherent to our nature, the end result of this discussion is still that capitalism is the system which you're arguing for, which imperialism is inherently a part of, in which it doesn't have to be. And so I think my appeals to the dangers of imperialism as far as arguing against capitalism is still inherently incredibly valid. Also, you in this example you give about tribes, they're ransacking each other for more stuff. In other words, it's the profit motive which still drives this. And because they didn't have a system which was based around mutual aid, which was, say, communistic, then yes, they still had to compete with each other for profit. And so it's still the profit motive, which is a characteristic of capitalism, which doesn't have to exist, which drove this imperialism, even in the examples that you gave. And so you just identified the problem yet again as the mechanism of the profit motive, which again is inherently a characteristic of capitalism, which doesn't have to exist. And therefore, I think
if I could interject, do you mind? So, see, this is kind of the thing, is that the tribes themselves, among themselves, often would live very, socialistically, right? But and this is basically, I guess, the point I'm going to make is that animals, humans, they can form collectives, right? The family is a collective, for example. But ultimately, I think in the end, those collectives will always, find ways to fight each other. See, individuals can want what other individuals want, and will go after those individuals, and I believe that's human nature. But it is also human nature to form collectives. But that human nature of wanting what other people have still exists, and in that sense, I would say collectives will unite and to take what other collectives have, right? And I understand that and I think that makes sense, right? But I understand that you're arguing basically that humanity as a whole will form one gigantic collective. But then again, I would argue that, I don't really, I'm sorry, I'm not really seeing how that would be plausible, how that would be feasible. I mean, there's over, how many people on Earth? Like 8 billion almost. We're drawing on that number. I don't see how it'd be plausible to form humanity to one giant collective where nobody ever has the inclination to go and, you know, take from one another. And even within collectives, you know, you see families steal from each other all the time. You see, if we want to consider the country to be a collective, you see, you know, widespread backstabbing and corruption in countries, you know, tribes, even within the tribes, you know, there will be instances, sure, where people even backstab each other in those tribes for things that they wanted. So I would argue that, yes, it is human nature to basically try to pursue what improves your life the most, I guess. And, you know, it is, I would say it is a byproduct of civilization that we've done a better job. We're not perfect, obviously, but we've done a better job of sort of restraining that and, you know, still thinking about others a lot more. But I think fundamentally, you still will have those bad eggs, a lot of those bad eggs in society, no matter how well you know, change the minds of a lot of people, you still will have those bad eggs in society that, you know, still want to take from others, still want to, you know, increase their own material wealth. And I know you're saying the concept of wealth will totally be abolished, but I would still argue that, you know, people would want to make their lives better. You know, in any system, people wish for their lives. Will probably want their lives to be better. And if many people, and if the greedy people, you know, selfish people, they will often see, you know, others as, you know, the exploitation of others as a means to improve their lives. And I would argue that in a communistic system, without the presence of a state or a hierarchy to basically fend off from those type of people, you know, I don't see how the system really could survive on a large scale.
Sure. So to address that point and then to address the other points you made a little bit earlier, so you say that you know, even if we were to create this communist society, there will still be collectives, and because there are still collectives, these collectives will you know, still want to fight against each other because they're fighting because they want things that other collectives have. So I would say that that's not necessarily true. I think that you know, you're making this argument from an appeal to, say, like tribalistic times, and in this case scenario, in the case of like tribal of like old tribes way back then and so on, they needed to ransack other tribes and so on because you know, they maybe had scarcity or they had a lack. Under a communistic society, no, not everything would be one collective. I don't think any communist argues for one planetary, centrally planned society that's entirely global. But there would be, say, maybe, or at least in my view, there would be different collectives and they would exchange with each other on the basis of mutual aid. And because of modern technology and production and methods of production which we've adapted, we will be able to easily produce enough to sustain each collective. I mean, like, even if you look at modern capitalist society, most people are sustained, and you know, this would likely be even more so this would 100% be even more so the case under communistic society, because unlike capitalism, communism doesn't value profits over people, and so more people would have their means of subsistence filled, and more people would be provided for. And so yes, I believe with modern technology, with modern global coordination we've adapted over time, and modes of production, etc., we would not be in a scenario in a communist society where different collectives would need to attack each other in order to in order to have what they need in order to, like, survive and so on, which was the reason for tribalism or imperialism and so on in old primitivistic times. And also, I would say, even if it is the case that in some cases communist collectives would still attack each other, which, you know, as I've just demonstrated, I don't think would be the case, because this was in old tribalistic times due to lack, which wouldn't really exist due to modern technology and so on. Even if this was the case, I could still levy imperialism as an argument against capitalism, because, you know, even if it was true that regardless whether you have capitalism or communism, sometimes a collective will see something that another wants and attack that collective to take what they want, sure, let's grant the premise that that's an occurrence that happens sometimes under communism. It still wouldn't be nearly as prominent a problem as it is under capitalism, because under communism this would just be a matter of some isolated incidents of, oh, we want what this other collective has, we're going to take it, which, you know, probably wouldn't happen because, as I've said, communism is an inherently internationally inextricably linked totality, an epoch in which all countries or collectives are linked inextricably internationally. Sorry, I just repeated myself a little bit there, whatever. But even if we were going to grant the premise that sometimes these isolated incidents would happen under communism, it's still not the same as under capitalism, because under capitalism, this isn't like some isolated incidents, which is just the product of somebody wanting something that another collective has. This is a direct product of an inherent mechanism which this system itself necessitates, specifically the tendency towards the infinite expansion of capital, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. To touch on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, this proves that capitalism cannot exist in a bubble, because profits are constantly falling, and unless the capitalists of the national or of the nation can continue to expand their profits, to continue to expand their markets, the economy is going to collapse. So in order to keep the economy from collapsing, they have to engage in things like imperialism, like the exploitation of natural resources, etc. So, even if I were to be generous and give you the premise that this would happen sometimes under communism as a result of collective wanting something that another collective has, it's still not necessitated by the system in the same way, and it's in the same way that imperialism under capitalism is, and therefore it's not the same problem to the same extent at all to by any degree or even close. So I would still say that if I were to give you that premise, I could still levy imperialism as an argument against capitalism as opposed to communism. Second of all, you say that if communism were established, people would still be greedy. And again, I would have to appeal to some earlier arguments about human nature. Scientific studies have been overwhelmingly clear that humans have the capacity for greed and humans have the capacity for altruism. And this is seen in babies. The study I'm referring to is on babies and toddlers and so on. And so humans have, these studies find that humans have the capacity for altruism and the capacity for greed. And the extent to which these different capacities are actualized are heavily dependent on environmental influence. And this is because there is no static human nature. Human nature has many contradictory tendencies, many contradictory aspects. And the extent to which these different aspects are actualized are dependent on the ever-changing material conditions, the ever-changing environment. So to appeal to this static human nature that would always exist regardless of environment is just completely wrong. It's not consistent with science. It's not consistent with history. Again, if your premise was true that people are too greedy for communism to function, the communes which you yourself appealed to earlier wouldn't have been able to function. The Paris communes wouldn't have been able to function. The German communes wouldn't have been able to function. Revolutionary Catalonia wouldn't have been able to function. Like the history just clearly disagrees with this premise and clearly invalidates it, as does modern science, modern studies, etc. And again, even if these premises were valid, that people are inherently greedy and greedy people can't work together, one of these premises would have to be wrong by virtue of the fact that we're living under capitalism right now, because capitalism itself necessitates large amounts of cooperation and so on, as you yourself referred to it earlier as a system of mutual aid. So therefore, you have to admit that capitalism requires large amounts of cooperation, and therefore, even if we are inherently greedy, the premise that inherently greedy people can't cooperate is therefore not a valid premise, and therefore you can't extrapolate it to the argument that you're trying to make. You also say that you have to do things that are good for other people under capitalism in order to get what's the word I'm looking for? Get something back, I guess, be compensated for it is the word. I don't think that's true. I think that under capitalism, it's set up in a way that in order to be provided for, in order to obtain the means of subsistence, in order to survive, you have to engage in wage labor. You have to be exploited, and the capitalist in this circumstance exploits this surplus value, takes this value from the worker, and so on. And so, well, I think that it's true, and it would also be true that under communism, the essential basis of mutual aid is that you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's the basic premise of mutual aid, is like collectives saying, I'm going to lend you these goods and help you when you need it, and then you help me. That's the basis of mutual aid, which is what many communists advocate for. And so this argument that you're using to explain why capitalism is good also applies to communism. However, the character which this takes under communism is not inherently exploitative and involuntary as it is under capitalism. And I say that it is that way under capitalism because of the premises I've already went over, as far as the extraction of surplus value, the inherent alienation which is associated with work under capitalism, etc. So I don't really think that's an argument that you can necessarily make in favor of capitalism. You also say that nobody is taking anything by force. I'm sorry, I think you made the argument that like nobody is taking anything by force under socialism. And I'm sorry, what was the argument that you made on this front? You said that
Yes, what I was basically saying is that if nobody's taking anything by force, and in a sense you're willingly, giving up the benefits of your labor, whatever you're producing, if you're willingly giving that up to the collective, is that not essentially consensually owned private property that you're consensually deciding what you would like to do with?
Oh, okay, sure. So where I would say that fails to analyze what communism would really be is in the area that under communism, it's not like, I produce and then I give it to whoever I want. It's not based on private property rights in this way. It's under socialism, all work is voluntary, but it is also directly social. So the means of production are owned by society as a whole and distributed on the basis of free consumption by society as a whole. So it's not that like, I produce and then, I give it to whoever I want. It's that I produce directly for the community. All of my labor is directly social, is directly for the community. However, the reason I say that nothing is being taken from you or whatever is because the work is inherently voluntary. You have your and it's voluntary in a way that work under capitalism isn't, because under capitalism, in order for something to be voluntary, as I said, there has to be a reasonable alternative. Under capitalism, the alternative is starvation. Under communism, the alternative to working is not working, but having relatively the same standard of living. So therefore, it is a reasonable alternative, and therefore it is voluntary. And so, yeah, you can't say that something is being taken away from you, but that doesn't mean that it's based on private property rights. Also, you said that workers joined because of envy, and I don't think that you can extrapolate this to an argument against socialism, because if you look at capitalist revolutions, let's take the French Revolution. Why did the French people revolt? One of the key components, or one of the key causes of the French Revolution, is the infamous quote from Marie Antoinette, which I don't think she actually said. Well, she didn't actually say it, but it was a quote that everyone thought she said, which was, let them eat cake. And what that quote meant was, somebody told the queen, look, the people don't have any bread, they're starving. And she said, let them eat cake. And so this was spread as propaganda among the French workers and so on. And this sparked anger against the queen. And this is in large part why they chose to overthrow the French government. It was because they were angry about what they perceived as snobbiness, what they perceived as privilege. And so, yeah, if you say that communism is bad because the revolution is based on envy, which I don't think is necessarily true, because again, as I explained, communism entails the abolition of wealth. So you're not taking people's wealth, you're abolishing wealth so you can't have it. In order to be for it to be envy, we would want something that somebody else has, which isn't the case. We want to abolish what somebody else has. But even if you were to say that, even if I were to grant you this premise, you're saying that communism is bad because the revolution entails envy. And I would say to that, well, the capitalist revolutions, in many cases, such as the French Revolution, we know the causes of this revolution, and it was also envy. It was also an anger at the positions of privilege of those in power. So if saying that the revolution, which is used as a means of attaining a certain system, requires envy, if this premise means that that system in and of itself is bad and that this is a valid argument against that system, then you can't sit here and argue for capitalism, because the same exact thing was the driving force of many capitalist revolutions. You also say that innovation, there's this driving force of profit. I would go back and say that again. The large amount of evidence shows that we don't need a profit motive to innovate. So I brought up the Harvard Business Review study, for example. I could also bring up the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, for example, and I'm no fan of the Soviet Union. I don't like the Soviet Union. It was, in my opinion, state capitalist. I'm not a tanky, but we have to give credit where it's due. And one of the things that you cannot say about the Soviet Union is that it didn't innovate without a profit motive. The Soviet Union had no profit motive. And yes, it had generalized commodity production, which is why I say it never achieved socialism, and among other things, and because it was an isolated revolution due to the failure of the international wave, etc. However, we cannot say that it had a profit motive, because the Soviet Union did not have a profit motive. It was a planned economy, essentially. Yet, it started out as a third world nation where nobody could read. Literacy rates were, tiny. Most of the people were horribly illiterate, had terrible living conditions, etc. And it was by all means a third world country. And through the enacting of Stalin's plans and through central planning, they innovated extremely fast and even almost made it to the moon by the same time the U.S. did, even though they started out as a third world nation and the U.S. started out as, by all means, a very prosperous first world nation. And so, yeah, we can even look at it. We can even take, not taking into account the Harvard Business Review study, not taking into account the fact that for-profit innovations are being outcompeted by innovations which are from people who give them away, finding that we don't need a profit motive, discounting the fact, discounting all of these things, discounting the fact that under capitalism, yes, profit acts as one driving force of innovation, but there are many other driving forces of innovation and incentives which capitalism actively suppresses, which under the abolition of capitalism would be able to become much more prominent. Ignoring all of these things, we can even look at the Soviet Union, one of the horror stories people tell about socialism, and find that without a profit motive, they innovated extremely fast. And many people say, well, yeah, but that's because they have Western technology. Well, if that were the case, you would expect the innovation to have slowed when they caught up with Western technology in like the 60s and the 70s, but that didn't happen. They continued to innovate extremely fast with no profit motive. Also, I'm trying to remember the last thing you said. Oh, so you said that there's a finite line. You're saying that I said there's a finite line for innovation. There's a level at which innovation reaches as good as it can get. I don't know where you're extrapolating that claim. I never made that claim that there's a finite line for innovation. In fact, I don't think there is.
Well,
oh, go ahead.
Well, you were basically arguing that at some point you hit the line where you simply cannot make profit because everything has innovated basically, I guess, either to the top or to the bottom, however you want to look at it. And what I argued was that, there is always a way, there's always a way to improve the quality of your product so that you actually are profiting off of it. it simply takes more ingenuity, more brain power. It's something you got to really stop and think about and put a lot of work into to actually end up making that profit when all of your competitors have basically hit the same line where profits are very small to none. That's what I was saying.
So are you referring to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall?
Yes, that's what I was
Oh,
talking
okay.
about.
Yeah. So that's actually not the point. The point isn't that innovation reaches a point where you can't innovate anymore. I can make the claim, and I do, that a core realization of dialectical materialism is that things are locked in perpetual motion. Things are constantly changing, and so yeah, you can 100% make the claim, as I do, that there is no finite line for innovation. You can always innovate more. Um, However, my claim was, and you can make that claim aside from the claim, and also make the claim that there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, and there is a 0 point, and when it hits the 0 point, the whole capitalist system collapses. My argument isn't based on the assumption that there is a finite line for innovation. My argument is based on the assumption that all prices are based around the cost of production, and because increasing efficiency leads to lower and lower cost of production, if I can have a robot making my products rather than a human, I'm paying less. That's a lower cost of production. Because of increasing efficiency, the cost of production will go down and down. And because prices are based around the cost of production, the rate of profit will go down and down. And my point is, there is a certain point where rates of profit will reach so low, and this doesn't require the assumption that if innovation has a finite line that it hits, in which case you can't innovate anymore. But my assumption lies on the point that there is a point in which rates of profit will sink so low that the capitalist system will collapse. And I think this is very empirically observed. For example, a study by economist Michael Roberts in 2018 finds that drops in the rates of profit have been historically associated with larger economic collapses. And so if you take this to its logical conclusion, if it continues to go down, the whole entire capitalist system at some point will collapse.
Well, would you be referring to, say, like a singularity, and the point where we as a society, it would largely likely be due to the machines, as a society becomes so efficient that essentially it's impossible to basically create profit, because everything's so you basically, what you're referring basically is to singularity, right?
To an extent. My basic argument is that it's been empirically observed that as rates of profit fall, we see along with this comes economic collapse. And because it's also empirically observed that rates of profit have been continually falling and there's no sign of a slowing down or reverse, rates of profit are going to continue to fall. And there's a certain point, I'm not saying I know when this point is, I'm not saying it'll happen all at once, like all the businesses will fail, but we know that as rates of profit get lower and lower, collapses happen, and there's a certain point in which it will get so low that the capitalist system cannot survive, basically.
Well, so in a situation where human society becomes so efficient that it is basically impossible to almost have markets because everything is provided. Like if we reach that that Star Trek singularity point, then yes, I would advocate for a sort of more socialized. I don't know if I necessarily advocate for Marxism, but I would advocate for a more socialized system. But I think until we reach that point, I would still argue for my system. But anyways, I'm going to go through what you said. So let's see real quick. Let's see. Also, how many more rounds of this do you want to do? Because this has been what, an hour?
I have no idea. I think it's been a while. As long as you want to go, basically, we can drop off whenever.
Well, I think we could like split this into parts and pick it up other times. But
sure, we could do something like
kind of
that.
burning up in here right now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you and Lance want to also debate me and Max at some other point about trans issues, we can also do that next week.
Okay, and we could continue this capitalist
yeah,
communist
sure,
debate.
sure.
Because I think we could talk about this for like 24 hours straight.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's see. Where did you start? So you started a long way back. Let me think. So you started all the way back with like rebuttaling my points about imperialism, right?
Yeah,
Something
I
like
think
that.
so. Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay. So what I would point out, and again, you can pin this on a capitalist system, but oftentimes the most imperialistic countries or entities are often, the most prosperous, and
Wait, what did you say? I'm
especially if
sorry,
you're
you
going
cut
to make it
out.
like the most imperial. You basically said that the driving force of imperialism, at least outside the capitalist system, the driving force for imperialism would simply be that drive to survive, not that drive to prosper. But I would argue that the most imperialistic countries are often the most prosperous countries. I mean, wouldn't you agree with that? Like, oftentimes, and wars, even in poor countries, right? Oftentimes, the wars are not started by, you know, small time people, I guess with the exception of some peasant uprisings, but oftentimes wars are ran by those who have a lot, right? It's like oftentimes wars are actually ran by those who are most prosperous, and they're simply greedy for more. Now, this is not to say that there aren't also poor people who, simply want to survive, because that's true. What I'm saying is that, and this is observable in our society, which is that, there are people who, yes, they commit crime to survive. That's certainly true. But there's also people on the top who would be perfectly fine with, not committing crime, and they still choose to do it. I mean, it's like the United States, for example. Oftentimes, the United States, yes, has engaged in imperialism multiple times, right? Never once was that done by a drive to that simply, oh, we need to survive. We were, I mean, the United States through most of its history has been extremely prosperous as compared to the rest of the world, and yet you find that a lot of times, even though people are extraordinarily prosperous and surviving just fine, oftentimes they still have a drive for more. So I would, reject the idea that because under communism everyone would have that basic level of decency where they don't need to try to take from others what they want. I would argue that that's not true, because oftentimes if you look in history, right, it is those who are most prosperous who actually are the ones who have everything they need to survive. Oftentimes it is those who are actually the ones trying to gain more, and it's not even necessarily for the purpose of expanding the capitalist markets in their countries. Oftentimes it's just because they simply want more for themselves, right? A lot of these imperialist leaders throughout history haven't been thinking, oh, I want to like necessarily been thinking primarily, oh, I want to expand the market so that my economy does better. Oftentimes is, no, I want to make more money for myself, right? That's the logic of a bank robber, and often in many cases, and that's the logic of like a imperialist leader. So I'll go through the rest of my points. Yeah, you talked about how collectives, so you basically talk about collectives, exchanging with one another for mutual benefit. I'd like to inquire how that's basically different from the basic principle of trade, right? Because under trade, I mean, the basic premise of trade, obviously, under a capitalist system, it's gotten very much more complex. But the basic premise of trade is essentially, I am either one individual or one collective, and again, I want to benefit and you want to benefit, so we're going to exchange with each other to mutually benefit. And now, let me look. I had a point about this. Yeah, so it is true that if the collectives are equal levels of prosperity, then there won't really be an imbalance, right? The trade will essentially be mutual. But what you're describing in the capitalist system is basically where, obviously the worker has far less negotiating power than the employer. And in that sense, the employer is allowed to, exploit the employee. Well, in that same sense, how would that principle not apply to collectives, in the sense that, okay, let's be totally realistic, right? In communist systems, it is true that at least for some short periods of time, you could have some collectives that are doing better than other collectives, and some collectives that are struggling a little bit more. So, if say a struggling collective is doing mutual aid with a prosperous collective, is it not true that if one collective has everything, they really has everything they need, right? They don't really need anything. If one collective has everything they need and the other collective is struggling, then wouldn't the terms of that agreement, whatever it is, whatever mutual aid they're giving to each other, wouldn't that also be imbalanced? Because again, one side of this exchange, of this aid, right, is basically has everything they need. So in order to actually engage in this trade, that entity, that collective has to be really like, hey, impress me, right? Because I have everything I need. I have no reason to trade with you. Whereas that struggling collective will say to that more prosperous collective, listen, we're in dire needs here, and I will stoop. I suppose I'll say it like this: I will stoop to a lower level, essentially, to basically receive aid from you. If you, I guess I'll let you respond to that, and then I'll go on to my other other stuff I had.
Sure. So you said that if two collectives are engaging in mutual aid, and one collective has just more than another collective, and they're engaging in mutual aid, there's still bargaining power, right? But
Yeah.
So,
and even if I can say this, even if they're not necessarily, even if they're equal in terms of prosperity, but they have different things, right? There will be different degrees of bargaining power.
So the whole premise of mutual aid is it's not like exchange. It's like when you're in need, or when you need this one good, I will provide it for you unconditionally. However, because I'm doing that for you, you are when I am in need, when I am lacking a certain resource, or when my crops fail, or when I am in a point where I am prosperous, or going through hard times, you provide for us. And that's the basic premise of mutual aid. And so this concept of like bargaining and power and so on doesn't really apply to this conception. And you can say, well, this is idealistic. This isn't really going to happen. This is, people aren't just going to unconditionally, altruistically do good things for one another with the expectation that other people are going to be this back. However, in order to say that this is idealistic, you have to negate a lot of history, because Peter Kropotkin's book, again, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, the core point of the book was to address why this isn't idealistic, and how we've seen societies run on the basis of mutual aid, actualizing this aspect, or this tendency, or this capacity of human nature successfully, showing that this is something that we can base societies off of, because many societies have done it and base their societies around this premise. And not only that, but when societies have based their societies around this premise, this has led to greater prosperity, greater innovation as far as art and technology and so on, among these nations and societies which have implemented this. Hello?
I'm sorry. Give me just 1 second if you don't mind. I'll be like 20 seconds on.
Sure.
Okay, so you cite, obviously, like, examples in nature. Well, I'll again say that, yeah, it is true that, if we're talking about, let's just say, ants in a colony, or lions forming herds and fighting with each other for territory, it is true that, again, this kind of goes back to my point, which is that, yes, collectives can absolutely form and work together, but
Yes,
when
yeah, you
was that, did you hear it?
No, you.
Okay, so you thought. Okay, so you talked basically about about examples in nature, and again, this basically goes back to what my point was, which is that, yes, it is absolutely true that collectives can totally form and work together. My point basically, like, for example, the concept of a nation is sort of a concept of a collective, right? But what my argument basically was that these collectives also, it is true that while it is true that these collectives will form, it is in nature, I don't really see these collectives, working with one another. I mean, for example, an ant colony, these ants will all work together, but I very rarely will see, these ants working with other ant colonies, and the same is true of, like, let's say predators, right? Like lions. Lion herds don't really work together, and if anything, they fight with one another for, that territory, for hunting grounds, for food, stuff like that. So, anyways, let me go on to the other things I was gonna say. Let's see. Okay, so again, with that out of the way, I'll kind of like question, yes, whether it is, realistic that people will, agree to help each other based off of no premise other than, they simply want to. You know what I mean? Like, I don't really see the I don't see it that people will be so altruistic that they will be willing to help others without, by the way, without any actual guarantee of benefit back, right? You can have agreements with one another, and you can help the other person. And I'm sure we've all experienced this, where we kind of have a mutual agreement to help one another, and we help the other person. And then when we're in need, because there's no like nothing legally binding us to help one another, we often find ourselves backstabbed. We find that the other group does not help us, and also, I don't understand, like, what is the driving force in communism for, collectives to actually make those types of agreements with one another. But let's see, I'm kind of over the place right now, but let's look at the other stuff I had to say. Okay, so you talked like probably like half an hour ago by this point, but you talked about like how essentially under communism, if you want to work, right, you have that option, but also if you don't want to work, then you don't have to. Well, the thing I would say is that building a society is actually, it takes a lot of hard work, and I would argue that I don't see that. First of all, I don't consider it fair that someone who does not contribute anything to help his or her community, why is it that someone who contributes nothing, and just sits around, does whatever they want, and acts in selfish accord, why it is that another person should therefore have to first of all have to compensate for their work, right? By working extra hard to do the things that that other person could easily help with, but they choose not to. But moreover than that, I don't see how it is fair for the person who does nothing, contributes nothing to the community, deserves the same quality of life and the same position in the community as the person who is actually working and is actually trying really hard and cares to contribute to this community. Let's see what else I had to say. So you talk about French Revolution being caused by envy. I'm not saying that such, actually I should probably plug my computer, give me a second. But I'm not saying that such revolutions or wars weren't caused by envy. All I'm saying is that that's also true of communism. And I think it's also true that a lot of workers who have led communist or socialist style revolutions throughout history at least had some form of envy. And you don't have to call it envy, but at least some type of emotion that basically said to them, I really want, I see these people on the top, I'm jealous of them, or I feel upset that I don't have, the same quality of life they have. And I believe that even in, a socialist system, there is still sort of this driving force of, wanting what you don't have. Anyways, give me a second to plug my computer. Let's see. So you talked about how the Soviet Union was able to basically innovate without, any sort of capitalist system. And well, part of the reason, first of all, you did mention it is state-run capitalist. So there was still some form of hierarchy basically running the whole thing. But moreover than that, people worked in the Soviet Union because there was more or less a gun to everyone's heads forcing them to work. The reasonable alternative to not working in the Soviet Union was, you talk about reasonable alternative as, not starving on the streets or, not having a good life, that not being a reasonable alternative. Well, I would consider in the Soviet Union, not doing what the state is telling you to do, that the reasonable alternative to that is, death or concentration camp. Then I would also argue that, yes, the reason that the Soviet Union innovated is because, people were forced to do it. And I would argue that they were forced to do it with a much higher degree of force than they were in capitalism, because under a capitalist system, it's almost as if I think how I word this, there's a little bit, it's more of an indirect, if you want to call it an unreasonable alternative, that's fine, but it's more indirect, like it's almost like a negative in the sense that in a capitalist system, sorry, my grandma interrupted me. In a capitalist system, when you choose not to work, right, you sort of face the consequences on your own. In the sense that when you choose not to work, it is it is you that, you know, it ultimately creates those consequences for yourself. Whereas in a system like the Soviet Union or communist Cuba or China, right? If you choosing not to work, it's not a matter of, oh, then if you don't want to work, then you're going to face the consequences of it, and you can see what happens if you don't want to work, right? In these, you know, state, or if you don't want to call them communists, I can call them state-run capitalists if you want. In these state-run capitalist systems, you know, the alternative is a positive in this is a positive, not saying it's a good thing, but it's a positive in the sense that, you know, other people will directly come to you and either kill you or drag you out to Siberia. You know what I'm saying? You know, so the 5-year plan was not sort of this not exactly libertarian socialism. I mean, it was freaking brutal. The state was running things, not the working collectives, and that is the reason that the system innovated, was because the state was basically holding a gun to everyone's heads and forcing everyone to work by force. And obviously, yes, if you force the peasants, you know, into these industrial jobs, and give me a sec, you force the peasants into these industrial jobs and, you know, threaten them with death or a concentration camp if they don't work, then yes, obviously you're going to industrialize. The driving force was not the voluntary consent of the workers. The driving force was the fact that the state was pointing a gun to everyone's heads. And so I don't know if you want to like maybe respond to that, and then we can like wrap this up and, you know, continue at another point. We can.
I'll just make one response, and then we can finish this up some other time. So I'm going to go back to the first arguments you made. So you say that most imperialist nations are the most prosperous, and yeah, that's true. But I would say that one proves the point that capitalism incentivizes imperialism, because countries are able to become more prosperous through imperialism in the context of the capitalist mode of production. So making that realization just proves the point that the capitalist mode of production incentivizes and exacerbates the problem of imperialism, which is increasingly dangerous.
If I could interject, because this is like the last run of this, right?
Yeah. Sure.
That is also true under a communist system, right? If you were to take the resources, if you were to take over another collective and take the resources of that collective, your collective would be significantly more prosperous than it were without all that other collective's resources.
Sure, but again, what I would say is that you know, again, in response to the argument that, you know, you say that there would be some cases in communist society where collectives would see other collectives that have more, and they would say, you know, we want what you have, so we're going to take it. And you know, you can say this, and I would say that, you know, this is largely unlikely, because the system would be inherently different, because countries would be more inextricably internationally linked, and also linked in a system of mutual aid internationally. And so this would be much less the case, and conflict would be minimized. But even if I were to grant you the premise that there would be some isolated cases where collectives would want something that another collective has and take it. Sure, I can grant you that premise and still use imperialism as an argument against capitalism, because even if I were to grant you that premise, the problem of imperialism is inherently ingrained into the inherent mechanisms of the capitalist system, in a way which they wouldn't be under communism, even if I were to grant you that these isolated incidences of collectives dominating each other would still happen. And also you say that, and also I'd bring up the fact that most imperialist nations are the most prosperous, not only because they can do imperialism to become more prosperous, but also because prosperous nations have more means through which to do imperialism, because, you know, imperialism requires military spending, etc., and therefore imperialist nations have more, or prosperous nations have more means with which to succeed in imperialistic endeavors. You also say that wars are caused by big countries who want more. You said at one point during your argumentation, which, yeah, I mean, wars are caused by bigger countries who want more. And in admitting that, you're admitting that it is this wanting more, this profit motive, which inherently drives imperialism. You could say, well, it would be the same thing under communism, because you could, you know, still get more, but again, it's not baked into the inherent tendencies or the inherent mechanisms of the system in the way that it is under capitalism. And the profit motive doesn't play the same role as it does under capitalism. And also you say that mutual aid, how is it different than trade? And so trade is characterized by generalized commodity production, things being produced for the purpose of exchange, for the purpose of exchange on a market, for other exchange values. My argument would be that mutual aid is inherently different because it's not production for exchange value, and therefore it's not production for it's not generalized commodity production because it's produced for the direct use value of another community. You're not getting something in return in the initial transaction. You're producing something for the direct use value of another community, and with that having the understanding that when you are in trouble, they're going to produce things for your direct use value and help you out, and you're gonna scratch each other's backs and so on. And then you said that mutual aid is unrealistic because collectives, even if you point to societies which had mutual aid, these collectives didn't have mutual aid among each other. That's actually largely untrue. If we look at many species of things like ants, the collectives do engage with mutual aid with each other. And also, not only that, but if you look at many of the civilizations I appealed to, many of them were segmented into different like guilds and different like workers' councils and so on, engaging in is true that they consisted of multiple collectives engaging in mutual aid between collectives. So therefore we see that mutual aid between collectives is a valid system which has been proven to work, and not only proven to work and function, but according to Peter Kropotkin's evolutionary biological analysis of mutual aid as a product of evolution, we have prospered much more, and we've been able to innovate and so on much more when we've adopted these systems of collectives engaging in mutual aid amongst each other. You also say there's no incentive for mutual aid, but that's largely not true, because again, the premise of mutual aid is that, I produce things for you, I help you out, and then when I'm in need, you help me out. So the incentive for mutual aid is the mutually beneficial relationship which you get into when you agree to do mutual aid with another collective, which benefits most parties. A fundamental dialectical observation that a collective produces more and is more effective than the sum of its isolated parts. And this is consistent with the dialectical law of the transfer of quantitative change into qualitative change. So it is true that engaging in mutual aid with other nations is objectively beneficial for the one collective, and we've seen this happen and succeed across collectives many times. It's directly beneficial for all the collectives involved. And so, yeah, there is an incentive for it. It has happened between collectives in the way which, you claimed that it couldn't. And it has led to prosperity in the way that this like dog eat dog mentality of like natural selection, social Darwinism, capitalism hasn't. And, this is seen across many other species where when they've adapted mutual aid across collectives, they've been more prosperous than when before they adopted that system. In other species which are very similar, or many races of the same species which act in different ways. And also you said that how come someone who contributes nothing is provided for? That seems unfair. I would argue that the reason that you say you should be compensated for work is inherently because you view work as a bad thing. You view work as a sacrifice that we should be compensated for, and therefore it's wrong for somebody to be compensated if they haven't done any work, because work is a bad thing. And therefore, in order to do it is a sacrifice which you should be rewarded for. However, the problem with that is it's only seen as a sacrifice, as Marx laid out in Wage, Labor, and Capital, because of the alienated nature of capitalist work. Once this alienated nature erodes, and once this alienated nature erodes, and people feel more responsible for their communities, more responsible for their workplaces, etc., they no longer see work as a sacrifice of one's time, but rather, as laid out in Critique of Gotha program, under communism, people would see work as a part of their lives. The distinction between mental and physical labor would disappear under higher phase communism. Under lower phase communism, commonly referred to as socialism, there is something called labor vouchers, where people who work more are compensated more. But once this barrier between mental and physical labor has disappeared, once work is no longer seen as a sacrifice of one's time, but a part of one's life, but as leisure, as is very possible, because as I laid out, work is an essential part of our nature, which we've been doing for millions of years, and which we've seen through things like UBI and displacement. We like to do, and we do because we need to do it, and we get depressed when we don't do it because it's a part of our nature. And so therefore the idea that it can be seen as a leisure and not a sacrifice of our time is by all means is plausible and not at all far-fetched. You also said that communist revolutions are often driven by envy. I think that if you look at where communist revolutions are most prevalent, it's in, for example, not in places where there's the biggest disparity between the ruling class and the working class, but it's in places where material conditions are just the worst. So, for example, like revolutionary potential is much more inflamed right now in the third world, where people are, killing like rich people and so on, because material conditions are so horrible. So it's not necessarily about envy. It's about the current system is providing horrible material conditions, which are very harmful to me and to the people around me. And I want to abolish the system that is doing this so that we can have better material conditions. And also, again, if a system being driven by envy means that the system is bad, or the revolution being driven by envy means a system is bad, then you can't argue for capitalism, because, as I explained, many revolutions, many capitalist revolutions, such as the French Revolution, were directly the result of envy, of hatred for those in positions of prominence, or I forget the word, privilege, that's the word. Also, you said that the USSS has hierarchy, and also work was forced. And yeah, I would argue against work being forced. And I don't think that it has to be, but we have to say, but my point was about innovation, and work is not the same thing as innovation. And I would say that my point isn't changed by the fact that it was forced under the Soviet Union, because again, I'm not arguing what I'm not arguing for something specific. I'm just arguing that the profit motive isn't necessitated for this kind of innovation. Like, we've seen places without profit motives innovate very fast. The Soviet Union is just one of these examples where innovation happened very fast without a profit motive. And that's the only point I was making, is that a profit motive is not necessitated, which, you can point to, well, it was really because of this, well, it was really because of this, but that doesn't really change the point that they still didn't have a profit motive and still innovated very fast in the absence of this profit motive. And you also say that if communist nations, or in communist nations, if you don't work, yeah, you still have things forced on you, like you're forced to work, like somebody will come to you with a gun, and yeah, I'd say that that's largely the case in many communist nations. But this to think that this is an argument which completely devalidates my point, assumes that my point is contingent on the success of communist nations, or quote unquote communist nations, which are really state capitalist nations, which it's really not. I mean, we can even look at within capitalist nations, free market capitalist nations, where we don't need the profit motive to innovate. And also, you have to take into account the fact that while profit is one innovative force, is one force for innovation, it's a force which devalidates and suppresses other motives, such as care for the community, such as doing something or innovating for personal fulfillment or because you enjoy it. And if this profit motive was abolished, these other incentives which it currently suppresses would likely take its place. So my argument isn't even contingent upon the success of other capitalist nations. And I would furthermore say that the only reason why these nations are so corrupt and so violent and authoritarian and so on is because, and this is something we can point to, is because of the dialectical tear in the relationship between the workers and those who are supposed to represent them, which is caused by the implementation of what Marxist-Leninists call socialism in one country, or the isolation of the revolution, as I call it. And so I think that we can point to objective reasons which are in no ways inherent to the goal of achieving communism, to explain why quote unquote revolutions have devolved in this way. Also, I would love to continue this conversation at some point, but I think we both have to go.
Yeah, we can start the next one with kind of like my response to, I guess, this part. So
Yeah, sure,
yeah.
sure. All right, cool. Well, it was nice talking to you. I'm glad
Yeah,
you
you
came
too.
on to talk to me. It was a good conversation, I felt. Yeah, I'll see you later.
Okay, see you. Thanks for having me.
Yep, no problem.